So good morning. My name is Chip Pew, and I am an employee of the Illinois Commerce Commission. And we have a gas, cable, utilities, phone, consumer services. We also have a rail safety section. And because the Commerce Commission has jurisdictional authority over all the public crossings in the state, there's probably about 20 of us, and we have federally certified track inspectors, signal, operating practices, hazmat, track. My role would be probably more the education and outreach. Been there about 15 years. Prior to that, I was with Metro Commuter Rail in Chicago for about 9 years, so almost 25 years in this business. And conservatively, unfortunately, I would say that I probably had to investigate somewhere between 500 and 600 train-related fatalities throughout the state. That's probably the part of the job that I don't like. I also run Operation Lifesaver, which is the nation's sanctioned railroad safety education outreach program. Every state has it. I happen to run the program for the state. I have probably 120 or so authorized volunteers that come out and basically do what we're doing today. They educate whatever group we think can benefit from the message. And quite frankly, we start at a very young age. Professional drivers, school bus drivers, driver's ed, mature drivers. It's an important message. So I'm here to do the educating, and I hope that you'll learn something that you didn't know. Maybe if we have time at the end, I'll ask you. If you know everything, please just lie and make something up. So we have the educational part, and then we have the engineering side. It's actually a three-pronged approach, which we call the 3 E's. We look at closing crossings. To me, really the safest crossing is either one that doesn't exist or one that does not intersect with a public road, either grade separation over the tracks or under the tracks. Unfortunately, we still have the second most crossings in the nation, just under 7,900. This up in Chicago, for those people that were on a train platform and maybe they end up getting on the wrong side, there were cases where they would literally crawl under the train to get to the other side. And some really assertive ones would even say that they wanted to file a claim because they got grease on their suit. And when we'd ask them, how did that happen? They'd say, well, I was crawling under the track bed to catch the train on the other side. So we started installing inter-track fence barbed wire along the high-speed rail from Chicago to St. Louis. We are, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later, we are putting right-of-way fencing to restrict people's access to the railroad property in places other than where they're authorized to cross the tracks, and that's at a public crossing. And then the last E is enforcement. Unfortunately, there are those people that don't get the message when you tell them. They're going to walk around a fence instead of cross where they're authorized to, so we end up having to issue fines. But it's not about the money. Care less about the money. It's trying to change dangerous and often legal or lethal behavior. So every year we all get together as state coordinators. In fact, that meeting's coming up in May, and we talk about best practices, what's going on in our states and what's working, what's not working. And to some degree, I'm always amused by the people that have Delaware or Rhode Island, Wyoming. And they come in proud as peacocks and they say, you know, we didn't have any crashes and we didn't have any fatalities. I said, that's great. But you also don't have any people. You don't have any trains. You have no crossings. Unfortunately, in Illinois, and for those of you in the Springfield area, you know we have a lot of trains. We are the nation's rail hub. We have over 53 railroads operating 1,500 trains a day. As I said, we rank only second to Texas in the number of public crossings as well as miles of track. Just about 7,400 miles of track. Texas is 4.5 times the size of Illinois. When you add to that we also have the third largest highway system, just under 140,000 miles of highways, streets, and roads, what we end up having is a higher concentration of potential, risk exposure. There are always going to be those people that no matter what you do, what you say, they're going to try and beat that train. And I tell those people, it's your choice. But having seen it 500 to 600 times, if you guess wrong, you're probably not getting another chance. In fact, just about every 3 hours, someone's involved in an incident with a train, driving a car, they're a passenger, they're a pedestrian legally crossing the tracks where they're authorized to, they're a trespasser. They're up on the railroad's property, either on the tracks or along the right-of-way, those 7,400 miles of track, without permission. And sadly, for those people that want to take their own life at the hands of the railroad. When Kyle was telling me how much time I had, I generally, and I remember when I first did this, I was nervous as can be. Just was absolutely deathly afraid of speaking in public. Now I can talk for an hour, hour and a half. But he says, well, not today. I'll give you maybe 20 minutes. So these are the ones that I really feel are pretty important. Any time is train time. Trains can be on any track, in any direction, at any time. And particularly in the Chicago area, on the commuter lines, where those people think they know those schedules. And to Metra's credit, they usually have the best on-time performance of any commuter in the country, about 98.6% of the time. But when they're off schedule, when somebody is sure that that 8 o'clock train, they see the headlight and it's 7:58 or 8:02, that's that 8 o'clock train. Unfortunately, sometimes it's not. Maybe it's Amtrak running late. And they don't bother to wait, they just walk right across the platform. And unfortunately, there have been people that have been killed because they don't recognize this. Certainly over probably the last 30 years, we have basically crash reports and information on every incident involving trains and people and vehicles that have happened in the state of Illinois. And we're data driven. We're going to focus our time and our energy and our efforts on where we need to focus, who are the people we need to talk to. Every year we kind of take a snapshot of, over the last couple of years, what we would consider the average Illinois collision. So over the last couple of years, it's more than likely going to happen in January. Thank God it's February 1st. After school, after work. Certainly these days people are working very hard. They just want to get home. Kids want to get home after school. The last thing they wanted to have to do is wait for a train. It would be an incident involving a freight train and a car. Certainly far more many cars, about 330 million annually, are crossing the railroad tracks somewhere in the country. For us guys, this is not good. 3 out of every 4 incidents nationally involve males. So ladies, if you're going to go out on a date, maybe you should drive. They're going to disregard active warning devices. So for those people that call our offices and say, you know, we have a lot of crossings of passive nature. There's no bells, lights, or gates. I think you need to install them and it would make them safer. That's not what our data tells us. Not only in Illinois, but also nationally, over 50% of all of our collisions and over 55% of our fatalities occur at crossings that we would consider to have our best protection. People driving around a lower gate. Not real smart. And surprisingly, it's not necessarily going to happen up in the Chicago area where 68% of the state's population lives and maybe 38% of the incidents. It's more than likely going to happen in an area like Sherman or Lincoln, some rural area where there aren't a lot of cars, there aren't many trains a day, so the people that are traversing those tracks don't see trains, so they don't bother to look for them. And in these communities, there's probably zero enforcement. If I could bring back the people that have lost their lives and ask them, what were you thinking? I think one of the things they would say is, I thought the train was going slower than it actually was. Think of it this way. We've all seen planes landed in airports, St. Louis, Chicago, wherever, and there are times where they look like they're barely moving. They look like they're floating on a string. When in actuality, if that plane isn't traveling in excess of 100 miles an hour, it would fall out of the sky. But because of the background, it creates an optical illusion. it's virtually impossible for the human eye to accurately judge the speed of that incoming airplane. Very much like if you look down the tracks and you see that white headlight that tells you the train's coming towards you. Is it a 79-mile-an-hour Amtrak train? Or is it a 10-mile-an-hour slow-moving freight train? And if you think it's the slow one, and it's actually the fast one, and you decide to go, that might not have been a good choice. Once again, because you see the headlight, you can't tell how fast that train's going. Along the high-speed rail corridor today, there is a 15-mile stretch where the Amtrak does get up to 110 miles an hour. So it makes it even more important. If you see that train, just wait.
Question.
Yes?
Are the freight railroads increasing their speeds through the state?
Not that I've heard of, but they certainly, based on whatever kind of track is out there, they can do that. They kind of prescribe their own speed based on telemetry of the track, what's the track weight and conditions, but I haven't heard of any increases. Certainly through Springfield, a 100-car freight train would not be uncommon. It's not the biggest. There are trains over 100 cars, but certainly for the sake of discussion, let's just say a 100-car freight train weighs probably 12 million pounds. If that train was to strike the average 3,000-pound vehicle, it's basically the same weight ratio as your car running over a can of pop. Think of it this way. You're in this can of pop, and a car runs over you. What's the likelihood of you surviving? Not that good. You'd be Orange Crush, and we'd have to call Dr. Pepper. I think those are the only two kinds that work there. These are approximate stopping distances of various size vehicles traveling at 55. And it makes sense. Physics tells us as you increase the size and the weight of something, it's going to take it longer to stop. That 3,000-pound car take about 200 feet to stop. School bus is a little longer, 230 feet. 80,000-pound semi, 300 feet, 100 yards, a football field. Back to that 100-car freight train traveling at 55 could take approximately 5,280 feet or what? A mile. 18 football fields. But these also assume best case scenario, good tires, good brakes, dry pavement, clear weather conditions. The person operating the vehicle had plenty of sleep the night before, so the reaction time's good. In reality, what's the likelihood of all those things happening at once? Not that good. Yeah, the tires are okay, but I probably do need new brakes, and the road's a little wet. So as you elongate these, you also potentially elongate the distance for that train to stop. Unfortunately, the general rule of thumb is by the time the engineer sees what's in front of him that does not get out of the way, it's more than likely too late, and that train is going to strike that vehicle and probably kill the people inside. And the average engineer that's worked for the railroad for 10 years has more than likely been involved in an incident where they've killed somebody. And there are plenty of cases where one is all it takes, and they just cannot get behind those controls anymore. For those people that say trains stop on a dime, that's not really actually true. And assuming that a dime is an inch, and a train takes a mile to stop, it would actually be 63,360 dimes. Maybe it was because I like the pictures today. This is the inside of the locomotive where the engineer sits. How many of you think the steering wheel's on the left-hand side? Works better with the kids. It always irritates me when I hear people that, on the news, the media, engineers don't drive trains, semantically. They operate the train with a throttle, a brake, and a horn. That's it. Essentially, it's just a big roller coaster. It's only going where the tracks tell it to. And being the official state spokesman for rail safety, I talk to the media a lot. At least probably once every couple of weeks. And every time we have an incident, I still try to convince them that the way that they report them is actually not helpful. We've seen it in the paper. Train slams into car, kills driver. When in actuality, because the train is running on fixed track, it's the driver's responsibility to stay out of the way. So what it should say is, the driver of the vehicle put the car in a position for the train to hit it. Driver killed. It's the same tragic result, but it shifts the responsibility where it belongs, and that's on who? The driver. The driver, the pedestrian, somebody other than the engineer. Two types of crossings in the state. A passive crossing, more common certainly down this way. First sign you would see would be the advanced warning sign. It's strictly an advisory sign letting you know that within the next 750 feet you'll be coming up to a place where the tracks on the road meet. Pavement markings, not always there, but in many cases, same thing. It's just another advisory type signage letting the driver know, start paying attention, the tracks are up ahead. And then the crossbuck. What is a crossbuck and how should you interpret it as a driver? Yield, yeah. It's amazing how many people I ask that to and nobody says anything. And it's okay if you don't know. But one time, this girl answered, thank God it was there. She says it's a historical marker denoting abandoned railroad. That's not right. It is a regulatory sign that means the same as you. And it's a little frightening to think that there are people, even my parents' age, that have been driving a car for 30, 40, 50 years, and there's signage out there that they don't really know what it means. Maybe in part because of that, the state of Illinois in 2005 actually proactively decided that we're going to make it a little bit easier. We're going to start installing the highly recognizable highway yield sign on our passive crossings, and we're going to even go a step further and put retroreflective striping not only on the front, but also on the back of that. And even if somebody was not paying attention, that's a tough sign to miss. And initially, when I would go out and investigate a fatality, I would come to some that had a yield sign. And I'm thinking, you know what, they're not working. Once again, there aren't a lot of trains, not a lot of cars, no enforcement. But as time went on, I did see that we did start to have a reduction in the number of incidents at passive crossings that had the yield sign. They were actually working. It is now a federal regulation that all crossings either have a yield sign or a stop sign. In part because we wanted to be consistent with what the crossbuck actually means, we've kept with the yield sign. And the only time that we would install a stop sign on a public crossing is when it's in the process of being upgraded to an active crossing. And until the lights and bells and gates are functioning as designed and the railroad then takes over the responsibility of maintaining that crossing, we keep the stop sign on. And then active crossings. Something electrical and mechanical that gives motorists the indication as to the presence of an oncoming train. Red signals mean stop, and the person is supposed to stop and wait for the train to pass before they go. By federal regulation, once those lights start to flash, that crossing has to provide a minimum of 20 seconds of warning time before the train would actually occupy the crossing before it can get there. It's generally about 4 to 6 seconds to flash, 4 to 6 seconds for the gate to start coming down, and then the remaining 8 to 12 seconds or longer in the fully lowered position before the train would get there. Along the high-speed rail corridor, because those trains potentially are going to be traveling 110 miles an hour, we've extended that 20 seconds to 80 seconds because it would take that train about 2 miles to stop. So you can imagine the challenge in a lot of the communities along this line where they may be used to 32, 35 seconds of warning time, and now they have to wait an additional 45 seconds. And if you look at your watch for 45 seconds and you're not doing anything, particularly at a crossing and you're not seeing a train, human nature would say those people would be considering just driving around those gates, which is one reason that we decided to go with the 4-quadrant gates to effectively close that crossing and prevent that from happening. The other situation would be what we call the ghost train. We've all seen it. As soon as the gate just starts going up high enough where it's not going to scratch the paint on somebody's car, these impatient people go. And unfortunately, they do run the risk of pulling into the path of the train that they can't see because it's blocked from their view by the first train. does the mailman or the mail person know where to deliver your mail?
Address.
Address, yes. And it's unique to your house. That's how your mail doesn't get messed up. Think of all of our public crossings the same way. Each crossing has its own unique address. This is what would be the new sign. And this is it, as of the end of 2018, all crossings are either going to have this standardized blue sign facing the crossing, or there was some discussion where the railroad said we'd like it to face down the tracks so that if somebody was actually stuck on the tracks, it would be easier for them to see. And the FRA said, we don't care, either way, but have the signs up. And based on what is out at a particular crossing now, many of the information is on signal bungalows. And they'll have, obviously, a little bit longer to comply. Sometimes you find it on the mast of a post itself. Sometimes it's on a sticker. But it has the railroad's 800 number and then the crossing's unique identifier. It's 6 numbers followed by a letter. So in this case, it's crossing 123, 123A. If your car was to be stuck on the tracks, hi, it's Chip, and I'm at crossing 123, 123A. That dispatcher then, on a huge computer screen that oversees their whole territory, can make the determination as to whether or not there could be trains in close proximity to this crossing, and if so, they would contact the engineer of that train and say, we've got a trapped vehicle at the crossing 5 miles ahead, be prepared to stop in advance of hitting that car. Once again, here's some what's out there now, all compliant. It's amazing what you see when you're out there. This is an index card, like a recipe card. That's not compliant. And to make matters worse, it's sideways. Hopefully they'll get that fixed. This would be now, many of the railroads, in fact, as I came into town, I'm starting to see them starting to put the signs up in either direction. Standard blue sign. The bigger class ones, if you were to call the 800 number, you may get prompted, if you'd like to report a rush obstruction, press 1. If you'd like to report a rough crossing, press 2. If you'd like to report an emergency, press 3. Some of the smaller railroads, you might get the dispatcher directly. It's important to give them this information. This is a case up in the Chicago area, Butterfield Road, where actually there are 2 Butterfield Road crossings. And we had somebody call, they called 911, and you can certainly do that, but it adds a step to the process. This driver called and said, I'm on Butterfield Road. And the dispatcher for the Canadian National and the other one for the Wisconsin Central, EJ&E, they sit in the same building, probably in a room this size. And while they were trying to figure out whose railroad that car was on, they made the mistake of not stopping all trains coming. And as a result, fortunately the guy was not in the vehicle, but they were trying to make the determination because these crossings are probably a half mile apart on 2 different railroads. The train came and hit the guy's car. Fortunately, it wasn't a school bus with kids or a hazardous material vehicle. But the important thing is call that 800 number, give them that information. Sight obstructions. We have a statute that says 50 feet from a crossing, a motorist should be able to see 500 feet down the tracks. Of course, there's always caveats for non-fixed structures, like those ill-placed signal bungalows sometimes, or a building, or if a private property owner puts a building up, or even cornfields. If they have corn that's obstructing visibility, there's nothing we can do about that. But if it's on railroad property, they have to keep that clean. It's mostly brush. But in this case, the local public works just felt that it was a good place to dump a bunch of dirt as they were doing some excavating on the railroad's property. Fortunately, a bus driver sent me this picture, and I passed it on to the city manager and the chief of the police and mayor, and said, just an FYI, if there's an incident in which somebody's struck because you've now obstructed their view, they may own that town. How soon was the dirt gone? I think the next day. So here's our administrative code 1535-205. Once again, this is non-compliant, and this is compliant in the exact same spot. Oops. Well, take my word for it. It's clear. And so we encourage people that if they come up to a crossing and they can't see clearly, send that information to us, and we'll make the determination as to whether it's the railroad's property or a citizen's property. Most people struck by trains walking as trespassers, they don't get hit crossing the tracks, they're walking along the tracks. And the general rule of thumb is 25 feet from the center edge of the rail would be considered the railroad's property. How many have seen otherwise? Yeah. Most people that are walking on the tracks, they're like, I'm not going to walk down the center of the tracks. Any idiot would know you can't do that because the train goes there. So they walk on the outside edge of the rail, on the edge of the ties where it's still flat, because as you start getting out farther, it starts to get sloped for drainage purposes. But because the train overhangs the tracks at least 3 feet, is this person really any safer than this person? No. Maybe the severity of death is less, but they're still both in a world of hurt. There are situations of the 7,800 or so crossings that we have that from an engineering perspective, they don't lay themselves out perfectly. Where there is potentially short storage space for school buses or trucks. And a lot of times what we see is as the bus makes its prescribed stop, somebody that's behind the bus pulls around in front of them and then cuts back over. And now this person potentially could be overhanging the tracks. But even in a situation where the bus appears to be clear of the tracks, it could still be in an area where it's following the tracks. So this was an enforcement effort that we did, and we caught this trucker, and certainly he's on the tracks. It's a $250 fine, a loss of CDL for 6 months. And when we said, you were stopped on the tracks, he said, no, I wasn't. I just wasn't moving for a minute. Okay, clever. Semantics. If you encounter crossings that have crosshatching, there's almost always a sign that tells you to stop in advance of that, because if you were to stop in this crosshatching, you could be cited essentially for the same thing as stopping on the tracks. Don't stop, pass, or shift on a crossing. Once again, the main thing is don't cross the tracks unless you're sure you're going to get all the way across. Train overhangs the tracks 3 feet. Is that bus really clear?
No.
Probably not. And in fact, this was part of the scenario at Fox River Grove that was 15 years ago. Probably the worst thing I've ever been involved in, where the bus was clear of the tracks but still in that foul zone, and the train came at 79 and hit the bus so hard that it actually tore the cab right off the chassis. And 7 high school students inside the bus were killed. Okay, this is our emergency escape plan, and heaven forbid this is whatever happened to you, but it's always nice to know what you should do. We'll take 2 scenarios. The first scenario, you come up to the tracks and for whatever reason, the car dies, stuck on the tracks, flat tire, battery dies, run out of gas, broken drive shaft. Maybe you get boxed in. You look down the tracks and you don't see a train coming. What do?
Call it.
Get out. Call that number that's in close proximity. It'll be on that new blue sign here in the near future. Call them right away. Don't bother pushing the car first. Call right away, because even though you don't see a train, in a matter of seconds or minutes, it could come. Call them, give them that DOT number, that ENS information, and hopefully if a train comes, they'll be able to stop before they hit your car. Okay, good. Second scenario, same thing. You're stuck, you look down the tracks, there's the white headlight, the train's coming. It's an active crossing and the lights start flashing. How much time do you have? A minimum of 20 seconds. Not a lot of time. And it's certainly not enough time to get out and look for that number and call. We want you to get out of the car. Get everybody out of the car. Leave the stuff. We can replace the stuff. But it's not just enough to get out. You got to know which way to run. We want you to run in the direction that the train is coming from. At a 45-degree angle, 47, 39, whatever, pie-shaped, at an angle, We say running up track, because if you were to run down track or away from the train, you potentially might not get hit by the train. You might get hit by what? Your own car, flying car parts, exactly. And it's been a number of years, but probably 10 years or so ago, 2 years in a row, we had 2 people killed each year, so 4 people. They did the first thing right, they got out of the car, but they all ran the wrong way, and they ended up getting struck and killed by their own car or flying car parts. Are we clear on this? Okay, quickly. This is actually the number one way people are killed, trespassing. We average probably 20 to 25 fatalities at our crossings, between 30 and 40 trespassing deaths a year. And I'm a big Taylor Swift fan, but that's not good. This was kind of like a Groupon thing where this lady was advertising family photos. Are you kidding me? Senior pictures, huge. And I have one of these in my office that I got over the weekend. And every one of these I reply to that I can. But if you go on Google and type in people standing on railroad tracks, it's like 6 million images. You know, you feel like you're putting a forest fire out with a squirt gun. And even if it was a situation where it's private or abandoned track, the people that are looking at that photo, they don't know how to make that determination. They think that this is acceptable, and it's not. It's private property, and you shouldn't be there. Does this look familiar to anybody? I would be surprised if somebody gets this, but this is near here. What is it, Health and Human Services, like on 3rd and Grand?
Yep.
So the parking lot is across here. I'm sitting at the crossing. This is probably 120 feet to the north. People are lazy. They just want to walk right across the tracks. And we'll go down there every once in a while, we'll talk to them, maybe give them a couple warning tickets. Maybe the police will give them a ticket. And once again, it's not about the money. It's about changing what is dangerous behavior. This is at Illinois State University. I mean, it's everywhere. Even where we have signs, we have fencing. Unless people are checked and there's some element of enforcement, they just do it. And when you see a worn, beaten path, it's not like this just happens overnight. This is chronic trespassing. And actually, we've made progress. When I first started this, I would send this to a community. You got a trespassing problem in your community. No, we don't. Well, how do you explain that? Well, okay, I guess we do, but it's the railroad's fault. It's their tracks. And the railroad would say, it's the city's fault because it's their people crossing our tracks. And so Operation Lifesaver came in and we had a love in and now all of a sudden, you know, we're all part of the problem, we're all part of the solution. Interestingly enough, the people that are involved in trespassing are like 30 to 35 is the median, 40 to 49, basically 20 to 50. And how many people between 20 and 50 in here? It's not kids, believe it or not. And maybe in part is 75% of the outreach that we do is in schools. It's easy, you have a captive audience, and you hope that as kids, you give them this model, safe behavior, and they adopt it as they go on in life. Problem is, we could give a presentation today, and this weekend the dad says, hey, let's go pheasant hunting or pick morel mushrooms, and they're walking right down the tracks. Once again, guys, we're involved in everything. So these are the only 2 places that people can legally cross the tracks. At a public grade crossing, preferably with a sidewalk, or an authorized crosswalk like you'd find at the Amtrak station in town or a number of stations in the Chicago area. That's it. So if somebody's walking right here, $150 fine, mandatory court appearance. We have to change that behavior. Particularly in areas where it's just chronic, because it's not an issue of if somebody's going to get hit, it's only when.
Question, do you have a recommended escape plan for when the train hits a hazardous materials carrier?
And you're in a vehicle? Walking?
You're behind the accident and it happens, and you've got to get out of there. It's a gasoline tanker or a chemical tanker or a petroleum tanker. Me, I just turn around and get out of there.
Yeah, there was one in Florida where an Amtrak train hit a gas truck and, you know, a lot of the gas ended up being thrown onto vehicles that were actually behind that truck. And unfortunately, they were subject to not a good outcome. We always want people to stay at least at the stop bar, but that's not to say people can't stay any farther back. So here we are once again, restricting access to the right-of-way to prevent trespassing. Because the trains overhang the tracks, 3 feet, 25 feet is considered the railroad's property. And if you were working for the railroad, doing some sort of contract work, if you're within that 25-foot envelope, you're going to have to get with the railroad, and they're going to probably have to provide a flag person to watch you work, or no employee in charge at your expense. Surveyors are infamous for not wanting to have somebody watch them. They just want to go up and take their measurements and get out of there real quick. Once again, within that 3-foot envelope, people walking behind the back of the train. This guy's pretty smart. He's got like a little high rail. He's got this thing that he built. And the special agents from the railroad police were none too happy to take that away from him. But here's a scenario. The woman thinks, you know, straight tangent track. I got a new playlist. Well, here's a train. This is actually a train that had some fabricated metal. The banding broke, and it's hanging out probably 5 feet. And do you think if that train was coming up behind her, even at maybe 20 miles an hour, it could do some damage to her? Absolutely. Would not be pretty. Shortcuts can cut short your life. We all need to do our part to prevent another tragedy, railroad tragedy. Look for trains. Obey the signs and signals. If you don't fit, don't commit. Use the E&S signs for crossing information. Know your escape plan. Pie-shaped in the direction the train's coming from. Don't try and beat the train. Stay off the railroad tracks on the right-of-way. You don't need to be there. Everybody, somebody could be anybody, including you. I've been trying to get this sign pushed through the state. I don't know. It's effective. It might be a little too much. My argument is I'm not going to kill the people. I just want to wing them and get them off the right-of-way so they're not hit by a 12 million pound train. And that's it.